South African cities are swelling as people move to look for better opportunities. The pressure now is to prepare for the future by improving infrastructure. In our special feature, ENCA is looking at what our country's major cities are doing to set themselves apart and what challenges do they face in the process. How is urban living changing and what's the balance between the influx of people, storage of accommodation and gentrification? My guest tonight, Gauteng Human Settlement MEC, Lebohang Maile. I also have Martin Lewis, who is the CEO of the South African Council for Planning, and Ivan Turok from the Human Sciences Research Council joins us via Skype. Good evening to all three of you gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming through. If I may start with you, MEC, this problem has been with us, forever. Have we, over the past 25 years in particular, sort of began to even change the situation?
Well, thanks, and evening to you and the listeners at home. Yes, certainly we have. Because, for instance, if you look at the housing backlog I think in '94, nationally it would have been about 2 million or so. If you look at the number of houses we've built nationally, it's about 3 million. In Gauteng, about 1.2 million. But the issue is in migration, especially for a province like Gauteng. If you look at the numbers, for instance, every year we receive about 230,000 people to the province. And when those people come here, they need schools, they need health, access to health, they need houses and many other services. So the fact that the problem is persisting, it doesn't mean we're not doing anything about it. It's just that it's growing rapidly. And for a province like Gauteng, as you know, people see it as an opportunity to access many other opportunities. Just look at the economy, for instance. Gauteng will contribute for about 35% of the GDP, will account for about 42% of the total production output in the country. So it's Gauteng has unique challenges as compared to other provinces because of how it's structured and because of the being the central economic hub. Yeah.
Martin Lewis, are you convinced that we have prepared fairly adequately for the trends that the MEC was talking about?
I think the trends that the MEC is mentioning, that is definitely so. Have we prepared adequately? The question is, can we ever prepare adequately if we see the trends and the push factor from rural areas, from surrounding countries, and then the pull factor of a region like Gauteng, where there's so many opportunities and possibilities. So I think it's a case of how do we plan and how do we make sure that we can actually cater for these additional influx of people and what opportunities do we provide. And then also with regard to the planning is how do we actually plan to make sure that we have better densities, that we optimally utilize our infrastructure, and that is what we need to work towards.
Ivan Turok, are you convinced that we are indeed preparing for this phenomenon?
I must say I don't think we're preparing adequately. To simplify the response, we respond to the growing population of Gauteng and other cities, but we don't prepare. We're not proactive. We react rather than proact and plan ahead. We know the population is going to continue to grow, so we've got to invest in advance of settlement, not after informal settlements have been created. We've got to create places where people can settle in decent conditions and not try to retrofit. It's much more expensive to retrofit shack settlements after the fact.
MEC, I've had people say, look, the houses that have been built over the past 25 years are still far from where people are find work, which means that, people spend more on transport and such things, and there's no very real improvement in their quality of lives because they work, they earn to basically keep going back to work.
No, you're right, and that's why we have changed our approach, and the emphasis has always been on undermining the apartheid spatial architecture. And we have had settlements like Cosmos City, for instance. It's an attempt. It's not where we want to be. You have a problem now in Alex, for instance, which prevents you with an opportunity to can move people to areas like Frankenwald, which is next to Kelvin there. And there's many other opportunities. You've got an opportunity to deal with the Kliptown problem in the same way as well. Government has got strategic land in some of these areas that are affluent, that have other opportunities which could help us address that issue. So it's up to government to decide how we deal with that issue, and we are determined, and that's the direction we want to move into. For instance, I'll tell you that in Frankenwald, we're already negotiating with the developers. We could be taking about 10,000 people or so, I don't have the correct numbers now, from Alex that will be going there, and there will be mixed typology of houses. And if you look at our concept of mega human settlements as well, we want to move away from just building houses, but also building 500 houses, 300 houses, 800 houses. Want to build 10,000 and above, because then it gives us an opportunity to also mix and create opportunities where people can live together and not far from work and economic opportunities.
Martin, how have other people who've been more successful at doing what needs to be done, how have they done it?
I think the important thing again is to, and I think there's a couple of things that the MEC have mentioned that is quite relevant, is that we need to start working together, working with the private sector. Yes, government can do certain things, but government is not the only role player. I think the private sector is a very, very important role player. And that is where we need to tap in, and we need to get the private sector on board as well. Proactive planning, very true. It is something that we will have to do. And that is a way that we can then approach this and identify strategic located land and see how do we actually invest in that, how do we partner, and what lessons can we learn from nationally as well as internationally from other cities to see how do we address this problem. We need to work together. We need to make sure that we combine our efforts to address the problem.
Ivan, we have one of the most unequal societies you can get. Is it even possible to say that we can actually do the things we need to do and with the speed that is required?
You're quite right. It's a massive challenge, the level of inequality. So the rich can afford to cut themselves off in gated communities and leave the poor in the townships, in the inner cities and so on. That makes it all the more important for government to be smarter in the way it does things. And the MEC is quite right in saying that there is a commitment on paper to integrated human settlements, to mixed communities, and to denser development. But it's been really slow to happen, right? This was on paper in 2004. That's 15 years ago. It's taken ages to try and get some more creative thinking in government. It's very stuck. Government gets sort of stuck in the tracks, and finds it difficult to do things differently. So I think government has to come to the party. It has to form partnerships with private developers. It has to have a range of different solutions. And it has to use public land much more strategically, well-located public land, which is currently lying idle. And government needs to be coordinated, different departments, public works needs to come to the party, not just leave it all to human settlements. That's the way forward.
In fact, I heard the Minister of Public Works this morning saying they are moving with speed to try and release land that is already available.
Yes, I will come to that point, but he's raising an important point. If you look at how we have configured the departments in Gauteng, you've got the MEC responsible for human settlement, is also responsible for urban planning, and is also responsible for municipalities. So as you know, space is owned by the municipalities and they decide how land must be utilized and all that. So if there is no proper coordination between all spheres of government, we will have this problem and it will persist despite the fact that you've got plans. That's one. But two, at the national level, I think the president will soon be launching what is called a district service delivery based model, where planning must be based on it's either in a district or a metro, and all departments, when they intervene, they are coordinated through that district. So coming back to your question about rapid land release, we did say through our State of the Province address that we want to give people about 100,000 serviced sites in the next 5 years. And that's what we want to do at the provincial level. Work has already started in that regard. In the next coming few weeks, we will be giving out land, service stands that are available. It's available, not just houses. You will also know that we've got houses and projects that are not complete. That, for us, might be an opportunity to also fast-track that process of releasing houses, because there are projects where money has not been stolen, but the project is not complete. For instance, the service provider was appointed, they did a foundation, they were not able to finish off the house. You could give that house to people who are able to finish it off. And we've seen in most cases many of our people saying, give us service stands. Some of these houses that are not complete, we can complete them and all that. And I agree that sometimes government moves slow. And that is why one of the things we are working on and we want to perfect is the discipline and the art of execution. Because if we don't perfect that, we will have a problem. Because the problem is not whether we know what we're doing or not. We do know, we've got ideas, but are we able to implement those ideas? For the past few years, some of those ideas were not implemented fast enough and adequately, and we should accept that criticism and not be defensive. And that's why we need professionals who are in the private sector, who are outside government, to say, how do we work with them? And I was saying to him, one of the things I want us to do is to have a discussion with them and other professional bodies, because we also need them to help us in the municipalities, to help us make sure that we improve on this integration, on this coordination, so that they also don't just talk theory, because it might be easy when they are not in government to criticize and say you're not doing this and that. We want them to work with us so that they can also understand the world that we live in.
In fact, I mean, that was going to be my next question. How entrepreneurial and driven and proactive is the private sector? In other words, I mean, you can't sit there and wait for government to do things or say, government doesn't work, doesn't do this, doesn't do that. Aren't we allowing the private sector to get away with murder as well?
I think sometimes we do, but I think that's where we as a professional body, SACPLAN as a professional body, plays a very important role to ensure that our graduates and the planners that qualify, that they are able to work within an environment, that they know what are the policies from government side, what do they need to implement, how do they need to do that. How do they make sure that they guide the private sector? Because what Ivan was saying is that we're very much reactive, and we need to get to a point where we're actually proactive. We try to do that through spatial development frameworks and through the National Development Plan, but we need to do much more about that so that we get to a point where we are proactive, we know what we're doing, we know how do we want to do it, and we need to work with the communities as well. I think that's a very important part that we sometimes do not adequately engage the communities to come up with proposals. As professionals as well, we need to actually do that, and we need to know how to do that as well.
Ivan, how do we move forward without blaming one another?
I think flexibility is a very important point. Government not being so tied to compliance procedures, strict regulatory frameworks, and a bureaucratic mindset that nobody wants to work with government, right? There's a danger of that culture in government, that it's rigid targets, it's inflexible systems and rules and procedures. It's got to loosen up in order to be more responsive, to work with the private sector, with communities, to really create, appropriate solutions in different places. Every place is different, and we shouldn't sort of, as one size fits all, dump these houses down on particular communities. We've got to work with what's appropriate in different places. In some cases, it'll be much denser housing. In others, it might be a more suburban model. So again, that sort of flexibility, I think, is a key word for government to take much more seriously.
Gentlemen, that's what we're going to leave it for this evening. Gauteng Human Settlements and Urban Planning MEC Lebogang Maile, Martin Lewis, who is the CEO of the South African Council for Planning, and via Skype, Ivan Turok from the Human Sciences Research Council.